is also quite well known within our own community for the work that he's done. I'd like to turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Sabina. I was on city council for 8 years in Santa Monica. I was mayor for 2 years, and if I lived in a functioning democracy, I'd be in the state legislature today. And if I had lived in Los Angeles, I might have never even been on the city council. Green parties in about 100 countries around the world, so we've gotten to see different electoral systems that people in this country aren't even exposed to. So I'm going to talk about 2 of them, and one change on the state level, one change on the city of LA level. How many of you are from California? Almost everybody here? Okay. So let's start out with our state legislature, all right? Slide here. And I did this because I really want to get this stuff in people's head. We have the worst representation in the United States in our state legislature, and the next worst state, Texas, is 3.5 times better. Or conversely, we are 3.5 times worse than Texas. Okay, let that sink in. And the last constitutional convention that we had that set the size of our legislature was in 1879, when we had about 850,000 people in the state. We have 37 million. So we have 80 seats in the lower house, 40 seats in the upper house, 120 representatives for 37 million people. It's absolutely ridiculous. So number one, per capita, we suffer from great underrepresentation in this state. Number two, we have the winner-take-all system where we are in single-seat districts. So the result of that, first on the bottom of this, is that Democrats and Republicans, before Proposition 14, the top 2 primary came in, that's a discussion we can get to in the Q&A. But before that, essentially, we've had 5, 6, 7 ballot-qualified parties in California. The Democrats and Republicans normally get between 80 and 90% of the vote if those other parties are competing, but they get 100% of the seats. So number one, we have a system where Democrats and Republicans are overrepresented in our current system. And then what happens on the flip side, the smaller parties, Peace and Freedom, Greens, Libertarians, American Independent, we're underrepresented. And the people who vote for us are underrepresented. They never get anybody. Greens, we've won 1 seat in the state legislature once, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, very special circumstances, but otherwise, so you've got overrepresentation for the large parties, underrepresentation for the smaller parties, and then even between the Ds and the Rs, you've got this situation this year where the Democrats have 2/3 of the legislature. They didn't win 2/3 of the vote. WTF. So, what's wrong with all that system? So, first reform, proportional representation. Okay, at the bottom there. What is it? Instead of electing people in a single-seat district, you elect them from multi-seat districts. I mean, do we ever get exposed to this at all in our schools? No. And if it's in the New York Times, they cover an election in some other country and they say that complicated system that they have, as if somehow, people in Ireland or Australia or Germany or Sweden, they're so much smarter than we are. We couldn't possibly conceive of how to vote in these systems. But they somehow are able to do it, even though we're all in the Olympics and we're all in the UN, but they can figure it out and we can't. So, all right, how does it work? What does it do new for us? First of all, if a party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the seats. 5% of the vote, you get 5% of the seats. So everybody's at the table to start with, and then you have majority rule, rather than our current system where you eliminate most people from the table to start with. So first, you have majority and minority representation, so that everybody's there. Number two, more people vote. Why do more people vote? Because almost everybody has a chance for their vote to actually elect somebody who shares their views. Right now, if you're a Democrat in a Republican district, a Republican in a Democrat district, you're not going to elect somebody. If you're a Green or Peace and Freedom, you're not going to elect somebody. So, you go out, you cast your vote, it's a good, you're fighting the good fight. It's nice to, on election day, have your vote count in that number in the losing column, and then it's over. So a lot of people don't vote because they don't feel it's going to really matter. And functionally, it matters only to a small degree. But in other countries where your vote is most likely to elect somebody, the turnout is in the 70 to 90-something% range. For us, we're given these kind of con job numbers where we say 50, 60, 70% turnout, but that's of registered voters. And only about 2/3 of all potential voters are even registered, or half. It depends on where. So the bottom line is not that many people are really voting in our system, where a proportional system gets more people to turn out. Next, diversity and representation. In our current system, there's all sorts of different ways that you can imagine diversity, but if you have a chance to have a smaller number of people elect somebody, then different groups in your society can self-segment and elect somebody who represents them. Now, whatever diversity that they represent, they have a chance of that being at the table. From a gender standpoint, when you look at systems of winner-take-all compared to proportional systems have way more women than winner-take-all systems. And all different other types of diversity, it's just at the table to start with. And then finally, campaign finance reform. For as much appreciation as I have for all my friends in the clean money movement, I really feel sorry for them because they missed the point here. The analogy I use is in renewable energy. If we had to replace the total amount of energy that we project in a wasteful fossil fuel system with solar power, it'd be very, very difficult. The plan to go to renewables is to become more efficient and to conserve and then fill in that reduced need with the sun. And in an electoral system, if you have to have the money to win a winner-take-all district, you're trying to get people to vote for you who don't agree with you. To get a majority, the fact is in most districts, if you had, there's a whole bunch of different perspectives in a district, but to get a majority, you got to get a bunch of people who really aren't there with you as a core to vote for you. You got to spend a lot of money. But what if you only need 20% of the vote? Now you start going to the places, the community institutions, be it a church, be it whatever, where people like you hang out, and you're just meeting them, and then their votes elect somebody, and you're not spending tons of money in direct mail and TV advertising, etc., to try and convince people to get on board. So the folks who are trying to get clean money, it's going to have to be replaced by public financing. And the amount of public financing we will need is such a large number to replace the amount spent in winner-take-all systems that it's going to be used against us every time we want to argue to go to public financing. So all the folks that are spending all their time on that are really missing the boat, that you have to combine that with a reform of how we elect the people. It's not just, quote, getting money out of politics. It isn't going to work by itself. It's not going to sell, and it doesn't work by itself. Then gerrymandering. And here's one of the most interesting things. Think about the US Congress, all this la-di-da that we're hearing about Texas and how they've gerrymandered everything. Crazy enough, when we go back to the Voting Rights Act, the rightful desire to have really diverse representation has become a tool to screw us. Because what you do there is you draw districts. Let's say that there's a certain number of concentrations of African Americans in your state. Well, you draw a couple of districts that are 95% African American, and now you've put all those voters in one place. They get one representative, or maybe two, and you've taken them out of all the other districts. So the Voting Rights Act is being used to actually cut down the number of seats that people who we want to represent actually can elect. It's a crazy tool. So if you go to a proportional system, by contrast, you don't worry about individual districts. You can have a whole statewide district effectively, and then just elect people from that however they want to self-district themselves. So then we drop down to how can we do it? Couple plans. This is an interesting one that came out of some folks with the New America Foundation. And what this does is, instead of taking the whole state and making it a single district, a lot of people have been familiar with the ideas of trying to split California. It's too big, it's ungovernable, etc. And we also have the problem that we elect people from single seat districts, and yet the nature of land use, of economics in California is regional. And if we want to be talking about regional housing policy that goes along with regional rail lines, for example, we just elect people from individual areas, and we don't have a collective dialogue within a region. So this plan is to divide the state into 8 sub-regions, and then to run a proportional representation election from each. Now you start having regional discussions, and you bring people in with some sort of regional mandate along with proportional representation. So in effect, you're breaking up the nation state into smaller sub-states and still gaining the coordination that you have of everybody together. Here's the number of seats that would go with each of those regions. So an LA area that had greater population would have, and this is one where you have 100 let's say the number. You see the number there. So basically, by population, still you'd have different numbers of people elected from these different areas, but you're still doing it proportionally from those areas as well. This is a sort of system that would make a lot of sense for California. Then we shift from there, because I'm timing it well, thank you, Sabina, to City of LA, all right? We just went through another election. Everybody's mad about all the negative campaigning and all the expense, and only one woman gets elected, and yet no discussion of how the system did it. So, a couple of reforms for the City of LA. Number one, terrible turnout in Los Angeles. Terrible turnout. Why? The election is in the spring of an off year when nobody's paying attention. All right? So, in Santa Monica, we used to have it that way, but we changed in the early 1980s to consolidate our local elections with the November general elections, when everybody is out to vote, when there's all sorts of campaigns turning people out. It's president, it's governor, it's Congress, etc. There's a reason to turn out. Now a whole lot more people are part of the decision making. So one thing that the City of LA needs to do, in my opinion, is put a ballot measure on that changes their election from that time to a November general election. A lot of people argue, well, there's too many issues on the November ballot. Frankly, as Rachel and Jay will say from Santa Monica, we don't have any trouble figuring it out about doing local elections. And the fact is, we pay more attention to our local elections now. Our turnout in Santa Monica went up, enormously when we made it in the general. And again, are people smarter west of Sentinella than east of Sentinella? I think people in LA are capable of doing it as well. Number two, okay, the way we do these elections also makes them more expensive. Why? Because you're in runoffs. You have to run 2 elections. I mean, pretty basic. If you run in 1 election, it's different than 2 elections. You don't need as much money. So the reform that I'm going to get to next talks about how you do it in 1 election. Third, negative campaigning. Once you get into a runoff, your way to win, I mean, if we think back to some of the racist Han versus Villaraigosa campaign in 01, it's very easy to trash your other opponent when there's only one other opponent. But if there's 5 or 6, you can't play the same racial politics or some of the other ones as easily as you can, because voters can move around to a bunch of different places. But the way LA sets it up is if you end up with a 2-way race, you promote more negative campaigning. So what's the alternative on a municipal level? It's called ranked choice voting, where you can rank the candidates in the order of your preference until somebody ultimately gets a majority. How do they get to a majority? If nobody's got a majority after you cast your first preferences, you drop the bottom candidate off. Whoever voted for them, what was their second choice? The vote goes to them. Moves it up, eventually somebody gets a majority. And when you do that, you can have 1 election. What would that do in the City of LA? First, you save $5 to $9 million. If you do that for school board, community college district, and city council and the other citywide races. So first of all, it saves a lot of money. 2, I just spoke before about how it changes that one-on-one dynamic as well. 3, this so-called spoiler dynamic, where you're sitting there. Let's say that I had run in LA, and I was the most progressive person. And you're like, oh God, am I going to vote for Mike? Or maybe he's not going to win. And we've all gone through that sort of thing. You don't have to do that in ranked choice voting. So then what happens is, let's say that you voted for me with the first choice. I didn't win, but I was for some really great issue that you resonated with. Now the person who wins sees that 20% of their vote came from people who voted for me first. There's a clear mandate, whereas if you flip it in the other direction and they just go ahead and hold their nose and vote for the lesser of evil, now you've understated the support in the electorate for whatever that key issue might have been. So we send the wrong signals to the ultimate winners. They use it in Oakland and San Francisco. Couple of links there that you can go ahead and check it out. Finally, the number of seats in LA, per capita representation. We have the worst per capita representation in the City of LA in the United States. Okay, 260,000 to 1. We have 15 council members. New York has 51. Chicago has 50. We have 15. Our next most populous cities, look at those ratios of representation compared to ours. Nobody is close to ours. No state legislature, except for our own California, for the statewide seats has as bad per capita as we do, and only 3 states even have half as bad as we do. So if we make the districts smaller, it's cheaper to run, and we have more seats, and you're closer to the grassroots. How many should we have in Los Angeles? Well, unfortunately, the Charter Review Commission in '99 put up 2 modest measures to go to 21 and 25 seats. They lost, but there were a lot of issues about Black versus Latino that played at the time there that got into this, and we didn't have neighborhood councils. Now people have neighborhood councils. They're a little more in touch with how smaller districts can work and what the connection there would be. So down the line, I know I'm punching through this. In my opinion, what we would end up doing in LA, which would make the most sense, is a single ballot measure that does three things. One, it moves the elections to November. Number two, it increases the size of the LA City Council. And three, it puts in ranked choice voting. And then with ranked choice voting, the final thing I'll say here to close is that there's two different, look, if we were the size of San Jose, or the same sort of representation of San Jose, we'd have 39 people. If we were like San Francisco, we'd have 51 people. And our size was set in 1925 when our population was so small. So the final thing that we'd want to work on with all of this is, in my opinion, we should go about 50 some seats in the city of LA. Do we make them all individual seats? Or, let's say 51 seats, like New York. Do we have 51 single seat districts? Or maybe 17 districts with 3 seats. If you go to 17, and this was my last point, if you go to 17 with 3, and this is one of the things that just pisses me off with LA politics, I'm just getting out of that light. The fiefdom bullshit in LA politics where nobody will talk about development in somebody else's district because they're the representative from that district, and please don't talk about my district because then I won't talk about your district and how really bad development happens in LA. If you had several people from a district who came from different political backgrounds, you might have 2 Ds and 1 R in some districts, 2 Rs and 1 D, or you might have a green or peace and freedom mixed in that. If you have that, there's no ownership, and there's different political points of view in a district, and now you don't have that sort of dynamic that you have in the city of LA, which land use is so bad there, and you want to throw up. And that's one of the reasons that we lost redevelopment money, because they were so bad with that. So those are a couple of modest reforms that can help the state and the local.